Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this event, Fixing the Internet Post Facebook Files, Toxic Algorithms and Manipulative Business Models. My name is Kim van Sparrendak. I'm a Dutch member of the European Parliament for the Greens EFA, and I'm organizing this event today together with the People versus Big Tech Coalition, WAG, SDEPS, and my colleague MEPs from the SND and the left. Today, whistleblower Frances Haugen is here in the European Parliament for a parliamentary hearing on what she revealed in the so-called Facebook papers. MEPs will be asking her questions later about how Facebook system functions and how we can choose people over profit again. And the goal of today's event is to give people a voice in this discussion too, and to create an even broader exchange than just between ex-Facebook employee Haugen and the regulators. And I'm very happy that we managed to come together today with policymakers, experts, civil society organizations, and businesses from across Europe to discuss the issues with toxic recommender systems and manipulative business models, and more importantly, what alternatives we actually have. And the People versus Big Tech Coalition is a new coalition of over 100 organizations representing over 71 million citizens. And as you know, proposals for new rules for the internet are currently on the table and being negotiated. And this is a crucial moment in time, and now we have the opportunity and momentum to really make a change. We have an amazing list of speakers today, but also I want to ask you as participants at home to ask questions and really engage in the discussion. And at the end of the session, there will be a short break, and you will be able to also watch the live stream of Frances Haugen's hearing here in the EP through this tool, and with hopefully also a lively discussion in the chat. So before we move to the first part of this session, I want to introduce you our moderator for today, Dave Keating. Dave is a Brussels correspondent for international cable news network France 24. And he will moderate today's discussion, and I will now give the floor to him to introduce the speakers for our first session on toxic recommender systems and how to fix them. Dave.
Thanks a lot, Kim. Welcome, everyone. Yes, as Kim mentioned, so this is really our opportunity to have the public and civil society engage with the Facebook files issue ahead of this critical hearing that's going to be happening at the European Parliament in just a little bit. Now, just a little context about this hearing. This is actually just the latest stop on Haugen's European tour. She's already spoken in London and Berlin. And from here, she's going to hop on the Thalys and she's going to speak to the French Parliament in Paris on Wednesday. Now, she's already been busy here in Brussels. This morning, she met with Internal Market Commissioner Thierry Breton and S&D MEP Christelle Schaldemose, who is the European Parliament's rapporteur for the Digital Services Act. But even though she's making all these trips, really, Brussels is the most important stop on her European tour because of all the global regimes, all the global governance regimes, it is the EU that is most serious about cracking down on big tech. And this is something that will take place at EU level rather than at national level. So this is really the key day for her trip. And I'm sure, as I'm sure many MEPs will remind her during today's hearing, the EU has the world's largest number of Facebook users, more in fact than the United States. Now, the MEPs who will be speaking with Haugen today are currently in the midst of negotiations on the Digital Services Act. And after that, the European Parliament is also going to start negotiations this year on the new Artificial Intelligence Act, which will regulate the use of algorithms. So that's really what makes this key. And I think, in my opinion, more important than her other stops in Europe, because there's this active legislation right now at EU level. Now, more than anything else, MEPs are going to be looking today for concrete evidence to use to justify any kind of legislative crackdown. It's also a way for them to craft the legislation based on what Facebook's actual business practices are, rather than just what the company says those businesses practices are publicly. And of course, this will all be as recounted from this former Facebook insider. Now, we have two sessions happening today. The first one, we're going to talk about toxic recommender systems, the algorithms, and how to fix them to make them less toxic. And in the second session, we'll be talking about how to fix manipulative business models. What are the alternatives to the traditional advertising approach? Now, as Kim mentioned, you guys will be able to ask your questions to the panel. You can can type those in using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can go ahead and start typing those in now. At the end of each panel, I'm going to put your questions to the panelists. You can either specify which panelist you want to ask a question to, or you can ask a general question and I'll pick who is best suited to answer it. And of course, also, as Kim mentioned, you can stay on this feed at the end of our panels to watch the hearing itself. So you can go get yourself a coffee in the meantime and tune in again at 16:45 for the committee hearing. So let's start off with session 1, which is about these toxic recommender systems. I know the guiding questions that we really need to answer with this panel is, I mean, after the revelations that we heard about how the algorithms are specifically targeting, recommending hateful content, prioritizing the angry emoji reaction above all others, although that is something they ended. We can talk about what have been the problems with the algorithm so far in terms of prioritizing content that will make people angry. And then following Haugen's revelations, should we change the way that people are recommended information online? And if so, what can we do? What's best done through regulatory means? What's best done through best business practice? And how can we fix the current problems around these recommender algorithms? So let me introduce our panelists now. We have Claudia Pretner from Amnesty International. We have Sarah Andrew from Avaz. We have Kasia Shimlowicz from Panopticon. And we have 2 MEPs, Timo Volkin from the SND and Kim van Sparentak, who you already heard from the Greens and EFA group. Let's go to Timo Volkin first from the SND. Timo, you've been working on the Digital Services Act. What was your first response once you heard about these Facebook files revelations? And where do you see the problems in the way that people are recommended content online? And how do you see this discussion evolving in the coming months in the European Parliament?
Thank you very much. So first of all, I would apologize in advance for my bad connection, but I had to switch to the iPad. I hope that you can hear and see me, but it's always a surprise if the internet works in our offices or not. So the revelations confirm many, to be honest, of my worst fears. So, of course, we had heard similar things for years from experts and researchers, and we have all witnessed firsthand the incredible damage disinformation can do, both in the United States or with the Brexit. But it's a completely different thing to now have the confirmation that Facebook actively decides to tolerate disinformation and harmful content as part of their business model. So this is confirmed. So first and foremost, the revelations make clear how important it is that we tackle social media algorithms. So there can be no place in Europe for algorithms that promote disinformation and hate over sober political debate and high quality information for profit reasons. So for that, we need transparency and we need to break the monopoly of large platforms over our attention. We also need to address the platform's business model, and we tried this with our initiative report on the Digital Services Act. The current model based on highly personalized advertising and keeping users addicted to scrolling through their news feeds is what got us into this mess. So we need to tackle this, and this is why we need to change the incentives. One of the ways to do that is by prohibiting advertising based on personal data. If advertising has to rely on the context of the content we consume, platforms will have to take a closer look at the kind of content we consume. So suddenly, disinformation and hate wouldn't sell anymore. And one last point on the discussions in the Parliament, I'm still convinced that the DSA can be a success. It can change the digital constitution for Europe and a real milestone for the rights of the citizens online. But right now, I fear we may lose this opportunity and we may not use this. So discussions have to speed up again.
Great, thanks a lot, Timo. Claudia, let's hear from you next. Amnesty International is active in defending human rights online as well as in the physical world. How do these recommender algorithms impact fundamental rights, and why are these digital rights so important in your view?
Thank you so much for organizing this discussion. And yes, the Facebook revelations and the hearing couldn't have come at a better moment in time, in fact. So in the hyper-connected world we are living in, the online space is essential also for the enjoyment of our human rights. And via their algorithmic recommender systems, a few tech giants such as Google and Facebook are controlling the content we see online, the way it is presented to us, and how we interact with it. And thereby, they're also controlling the enjoyment of our human rights, such as the right to freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and opinion. Furthermore, their algorithms can actually discriminate against us. For instance, when it comes to the type of job ads we see based on our gender, the color of our skin, or our age. And above all, we pay with our privacy for using their services. And this is actually an important piece of the puzzle, because the toxic recommender algorithms are the result of a data-hungry business model, as we've already heard from Timo, based on bombarding us with hyper-personalized micro-targeted ads, or as they call it, relevant ads. And they are trying anything to keep us on the platform for longer, to show us more ads, and thereby make more money, increasing our engagement and putting profits over safety, as revealed by Frances Haugen. And as the Facebook papers have shown, a tweak in the recommender algorithm has actually amplified angry voices and led to misinformation, toxicity, and violent content being inordinately prevalent among reshares. Facebook actually knew about this, but did nothing to change it. The documents have also shown that Facebook is only actioning on 3 to 5% of hate on its platform. Online hate and harassment can have the effect of silencing people or lead to real-world violence. And it also disproportionately affects vulnerable and marginalized groups. People in the global south are at a greater risk as Facebook is investing less resources into these markets. And there's examples showing how the spread of posts inciting violence against ethnic minorities and Facebook's failure to curb it has actually led to real-world violence and offline harm. Facebook was actually able to grow their power over the last years, or actually decades, with little oversight. Now, with its rebranding to Meta, it is attempting to also control the emerging metaverse, and thereby risking to further engrave their omnipresence in our lives, which can also increase the harms that they cause. Haugen's revelations show how crucial it is for the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act to be as strong as possible to put in place the right checks and balances to end such harms. There is no single solution to these problems, but rather there needs to be concentrated efforts, and there needs to be a mix of measures. Some of them need to directly address the algorithms by, first of all, really giving people more choice over the way content is presented to them online. For instance, by allowing them also to choose recommender algorithms from third parties. And there needs to be strong oversight, scrutiny, and audit powers over these algorithms, or the black boxes as they're also known. Additionally, an end needs to be put to surveillance-based advertising, as already stressed by Timo, and platforms need to also mitigate and account for the human rights harms that they cause. MEPs are now really at a critical stage in the negotiations of these landmark digital regulations, and there's really a huge opportunity for them to truly act on the lessons they hear from Frances Haugen and put in place really strong regulatory safeguards to regulate big tech and the harms that they cause. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Claudia. Let's turn to Sarah next. Sarah, Avaz has researched how recommender algorithms spread information, and you've also looked into the spread of political messages and the dissemination of information online. So how have you seen this working for European elections specifically? And what's the role of recommender algorithms that we've seen in European elections? What kind of impact does this stuff have on our democracy and our society as a whole?
Hi, thanks, Dave, and thanks, Ward, and thanks, Kim, for bringing us all together. I cannot imagine kind of better group of people, to be honest, to be spending time with ahead of Francis's address. I can kind of feel my excitement building and hopefully building with everyone kind of with us today, because maybe it's the Avaz way, but taking the really positive model, this is actually a chance in which Europe might lead the way in starting to actually understand and then address the harms that we've seen emerging as the internet kind of converted itself over the last 20 years from something that was quite a neutral, chronological, organized environment to something where our experience of all the content online is absolutely mediated now by the algorithms of the very large platforms. And I'm completely aligned with all of the fundamental risks, harms that Claudia outlined. But with your permission, I'm just going to focus down really on one thing that I'd really like people to kind of take into their thinking as they're listening to Francis, because we see it's currently under threat in the DSA. And that is whether or not the regulation that the DSA might bring to the very large platforms and specifically to their algorithms should be narrowed down either to specific sectors or perhaps to specific content. So let's go back to basics. Amplification of online content happens when the content recommendation algorithms of the very large platforms retain the user's attention by prioritizing emotive or divisive content cues, just as Claudia outlined. The algorithm doesn't care if the material is legal, illegal, harmful, or trustworthy. It is programmed to drive profit. And it's the effect of this programming that amplifies the content way beyond its initial posting reach. This is not a theoretical risk anymore. This has been absolutely described by Francis, and we have described it and re-described it in our research, which covers electoral disinformation, but also disinformation on COVID, harmful disinformation in terms of inspiration content. We've been documenting it since before the 2019 European elections. Back then, we were sort of, I think, along with many others, focusing on the risks posed by bad actors and the networks they'd created to manipulate the way that social media work. But increasingly, our work since 2019 has moved on to actually the function of the product, the function of the social media platform itself, both in terms of how it moderates and differentially moderates the content, actually paying a lot more attention to its key markets like English-speaking markets, German markets, and Spanish markets, and leaving Italian markets and Baltic markets to basically fight for themselves, giving them no assistance at all. But the other thing we've really looked at is the effect of the algorithm itself. Now, I'm gonna just go into one tiny piece of data, because in the time we have today, we can't go into detail, but I just think it's important that the research backing the evidence for the policies that we're all calling for is really, really there. So in the last elections in Germany, just a few weeks ago, we decided to look at user preferences for media on Facebook. We took their word, we looked at the media that they were following, and in the main, understandably, they are following mainstream media like Der Spiegel, Tagesschau, and Bild. So you would have thought, therefore, that the algorithm on Facebook would preferentially recommend content based on the user choice, but we didn't find that. What we actually found was that content produced by the Russian government to influence the German elections was preferentially served, so it actually beat the mainstream media across all of those three mainstream titles. So RT content was reaching 12 million users, whereas the others were averaging around 11 to 10 million. And that's despite the fact that in terms of followers, we have 7 million users choosing and following mainstream media and only 600K following RT. So you can see that the recommender algorithm has just literally flipped that on its head and is pushing out this content designed to influence our elections by the Russian government to a far greater extent. I've just popped in the chat for everyone a link to our hub, because you can actually see all of our research there. It has open methodologies and stands for itself in terms of the evidence it's producing, and it's producing it across the board. We're looking at how inspiration content is artificially boosted to the profiles of young and vulnerable users. We've looked at how anti-COVID content and anti-vax content has been artificially boosted at the very time the platforms are trying to moderate it, and we believe them. We believe they don't think this stuff should be on their platforms, but their algorithms are beating them at their own game and are spreading it faster than their moderation can keep up with it. So the central message we have today with all of those concerns is it is essential that the DSA does not artfully restrict the product assessment part of the DSA. That's, to get technical, Articles 26 and Article 27, the procedural rules, where we ask them to look at their product, to look at their algorithm, to assess it, and then mitigate its harms. It is essential that that's not artificially restricted to certain kinds of content, such as illegal content, or to certain kinds of actors, so it might not touch the media, for example. This is a product assessment. Imagine that we were looking at driving a car and we were assessing a car that kept on crashing. Would we only look at the behavior of the driver, or might we have a look at the design of the brakes of the car? That's what we're asking the DSA to do, to look at the design and make sure the design of the algorithms is assessed and mitigated. And I'm going to stop there because I know we have so much to fit in, but hopefully we'll get to talk a little bit more about that later. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. That is super interesting what you were saying about the difference between followers for RT and the difference for interactions. That is head spinning. And yeah, if you can pop that report into the chat, that would be great for the audience. So let's move on next to Katarzyna from Panopticon. Katarzyna, I think you just popped another report into the chat, so you guys can check that out as well. So Panopticon has been recently published this report, which you found, which you just put into the chat, which found that Facebook uses algorithms to deliver personalized ads that may exploit users' mental vulnerabilities. You've also done some great work on alternative interoperable recommender systems. Can you paint a picture for us of how an open market of recommender systems separated from the platforms could possibly function, and how could it address these types of exploitation that you've outlined in the report?
With pleasure. Thank you for this great introduction. I do recommend that our viewers take a look at the research I have shared, because it once again proves the point that the source of the problem we are witnessing on Facebook and similar platforms is the engagement-based ranking system, and it is their business model. So my point here is that there is no way to fix Facebook without moving on from the business model that proves to be failed because of its very premise. Its very premise is engagement of people called users at basically any cost, including serious societal or individual harm. And if we all agree, and it seems that we do agree on that premise, then what is the solution? The solution is not patching Facebook with more prohibitions or obligations for this company to improve certain bad practices. It is, in my opinion, opening the infrastructure created by Facebook without destroying this infrastructure. Here I do agree with Francis Hogan that we should not break Facebook. We should not produce more demons in the place of one. We don't need 5 companies doing the same thing. We need that company do another thing, but not with its own means, not only with its own resources, simply because it's very unlikely that Facebook will invest at any point its resources in offering alternatives if it is determined to make money on targeted advertising. So what we are proposing for the DSA-DMA debate is to seize that rare opportunity and legislate so that Facebook and other large platforms become interoperable, fully interoperable, to the extent that its users, people using the services, are allowed to choose third-party services for everything they want to use there, including the very core of the Facebook machine, which is the recommender system. In this model, I can imagine that we have users opting for different algorithms based on their real preference. So, for example, if we are talking about children and parents, I can imagine that there is a non-profit offering alternative recommender system that specifically protects kids and parents using their parental control. They choose a system like this for their kids, and it is not provided by Facebook or Instagram. So there is no risk that once again, the company will fail on its own promises, but it is provided by a trusted third party specialized in protecting kids. Or we are talking maybe about professionals like ourselves or journalists who are interested in diversity, in reading newsfeed coming from different sources, different sides of political fence, be that in Poland or US or any other country where we have the problem of deep polarization in the media. Okay, so here comes something like BBC and offers the algorithm that does exactly that, offers diverse view because it is not optimized for engagement, it is not optimized for advertising, it is actually filling certain gap in the public debate. Or we are concerned with this information, fair enough, we can opt in for an algorithm offered by a trusted third party that does exactly this, filters out this information according to our needs, and so on. So we are talking about opening the whole truly innovative market for services that are not driven by the same business logic as Facebook is, and obviously are funded with different models as well. We can imagine subscription-based business model like the one we have on Netflix, where people pay, but I can also imagine something like BBC, so a publicly funded institution doing, creating the service that fulfills certain societal interests, serves public value, or I can imagine nonprofits offering these types of services. Everything can be imagined if only we have that basic, essential, still missing obligation in the DSA or DMA, which is interoperability, full interoperability for core services, not only for auxiliary services, and specifically the provision on people's right to choose third-party recommender system as solution to the harms exposed by Facebook files.
Thanks a lot, Katarzyna. So I'd next like to introduce Asha Allen, who I accidentally left out of the introduction to the panel. Apologies for that. So Asha Allen is from the Center for Democracy and Technology. So Asha, the center has been engaging in detailed advocacy on the Digital Services Act, bringing the civic space and democracy perspective to the discussions. How important is it that the EU policymakers adopt this type of lens as they shape transparency and accountability and also oversight mechanisms for these systems?
Thank you so much for the introduction and to the MEPs for bringing us together today. I think this is a vitally important conversation for us to be having on a vitally important day. And I just want to take a very quick moment to really echo my previous colleagues here in their recommendations. I think it's very clear that the way in which social media companies design their algorithms, the way they promote and demote content can shape the very nature of our democratic discourse. This is what we're talking about here, something that's going to have a profound societal effect. And the Digital Services Act is an opportunity to correct course, to kind of remove the opaque veil around the operation of content amplification, recommender systems, and pervasive advertising. And so meaningful transparency is an essential first step in better understanding the workings of these systems so that measures to mitigate their negative impacts can really reach the grounds and the groups that we're talking about today, because it's been mentioned by several of my colleagues here, how the specific negative impacts really are magnified when we're talking about vulnerable and at-risk groups. And what we must remember here is that the issues that we're discussing are founded upon pre-existing systemic systems of discrimination and the prioritization of capital over well-being that are manifesting in our digital ecosystem, whether we're talking about racism or sexism or ableism or these forms of discrimination. So to speak to the civic space lens, it's vitally important that we address this, because we are talking about the experiences of human rights defenders, of those who are trying to make a transformative change, and making sure that the systems that they are operating within, because of course the digital ecosystem can be incredibly vital to their work, especially taking into context the shrinking civil society space that we have seen. And that's just not in Europe, that's globally. We have sequential reports from the Fundamental Rights Agency speaking to that shrinking civil society space. And we're operating right now in the context of ongoing rule of law challenges in Europe. So this is essential that we get this right. So when we're talking about recommender systems and pervasive advertising. CDT very much supports the lines of our colleagues, and we actually echo the European Data Protection Supervisor, who outlines in his recommendation that a recommender system should by default not be based on profiling, again, to reiterate that as a default, and that advertising based on pervasive tracking must be phased out. And this is something that the DSA has the opportunity to correct the course on. At the same time, it is about being comprehensive and holistic in approach. And what we want to ensure and to align, and in conjunction very much with the recommendations of our colleagues here today, is that whilst we tackle these pervasive systems, which must be done, and we must be diligent in our pursuit of this, whilst we define the right regulatory framework to address these challenges, that we didn't inadvertently establish a framework that sets a precedent where the oversight mechanisms themselves kind of blur the lines of rule of law. It has to be very clear when we're talking about upholding the rule of law and upholding fundamental rights. To ensure that we're not placing, say, law enforcement agencies and government authorities outside the boundaries and levels of transparency and accountability that we are rightly demanding from companies as well. So it is about that holistic, comprehensive approach. And when we talk about accountability, it must be meaningful accountability as well. So the Digital Services Act must strike this balance very clearly, because to ensure a vibrant, democratic digital ecosystem that bolsters a civic space is an essential facet of our democracies. And what we're talking about today is protecting those democracies, ensuring those democracies, hardening those democracies so that there is more equal participation, and that we're not talking in 5 or 10 years about threats to those particular democracies even further. So we want to make sure that this balance is struck right, that it is clear, that transparency and what we're calling for in how to tackle these recommender systems and pervasive advertising is very, very clear, but at the same time making sure that we've got oversight mechanisms that work both in practicality, that abide by the rule of law, and that we are very clear in who it is that we're protecting, because we need to ensure that what the DSA aims to do is to bolster our online digital ecosystem and our civic space rather than hinder it.
Thanks very much. I think it's particularly interesting, all these political implications, as you mentioned, that this is no longer a theoretical thing, right? This is very real. Kim, let's go back to you. Now, you are working on the AI Act. So hearing the concerns that have been mentioned by the other panelists, what should we change about the way that people are recommended content by algorithms online? And what type of alternatives do you think are actually feasible?
Yeah, thank you, Dave, for the question. Well, I guess the great speakers before me have already explained how these toxic recommender algorithms use personal data to specifically target and manipulate people based on their vulnerabilities, facilitate large-scale spread of disinformation, and even paid influencing of elections with huge impact on our democracies. And besides that, there's the fact that people keep seeing more messages that spark anger and hate, that sends people right down rabbit holes of radicalization and extremism. And this is a threat to our national security and a danger to us all. Now, everybody agrees we have to do something about this, but there's a difference between false quick fixes that we often hear and real solutions that actually address underlying problems. Motivating platforms to take down more or automatically just motivates their power over our public debate. Another often heard option is an off button to turn off the algorithm, and opt out of personalized algorithms is what currently is in the DSA proposal. But this will not work in practice as long as we don't fundamentally change the system. Tech companies will do everything to make it as difficult as possible to turn the personalized recommendations off, as we see them do with cookie banners today. But we can do something about this. We can fix it. But to do so, we need to look further than quick fixes and tackle the root causes. So to get a grip on toxic recommender algorithms, people need transparency. So we need to know what the algorithms are programmed to do and how they're supposed to be influenced. But transparency is only a first step. Information alone is not enough. We need to empower people to act upon this information. And that is why internet users need to be able to influence these systems and gain more control over what they get to see online. And we've handed in proposals to stop online tracking, to bring privacy violations and polarization for profit online. And this would force platforms to move towards better alternatives, like other more democratic forms of content moderation. And exactly these proposals are the ones that find most resistance with tech companies. Unfortunately, some influential MEPs and EU countries actually listen to these lobby efforts. And this is where we still have lots to win in the negotiations, because we can only take on the established interests of big tech if both citizens and politicians clearly choose for democracy, safety, and the people over profit. And for me, a free internet would actually strengthen democracy. It promotes the exchange of information and it connects people instead of driving them. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So I think what we've heard so far is really like Sarah said, this has gone from theoretical to very, very real, right? I mean, we are seeing actual evidence of how these types of algorithms are impacting not just the public debate, not just our online lives, but now also elections, election results, politics in general, the attitudes of politicians. We're seeing how an algorithm that is designed to prioritize anger and prioritize the most extreme views then translates not only into election results, but also into public policy. I think it's interesting the different ideas that we heard about what can be done differently. I think in particular, this idea that external organizers could be in charge of algorithms, that if you had these algorithms designed and implemented by something that's outside of the company, then some of the profit incentive might be taken away. The temptation to design algorithms purely out of a profit drive rather than out of a concern for society or politics or this type of thing. So I think that's a particularly interesting idea, and it's something we're going to talk about more in the next panel when it comes to business cases and business incentives. So let's go ahead to the Q&A. We've had some great questions come in already from the audience. Go ahead and type in your questions in the Q&A, and I will read them to the panelists. So the first question comes from an anonymous questioner, and they are asking, I think this is a good question. It's basically, why has the EU policy that's in place so far not already fixed this, or why has it not been able to get a handle on this? So the question is, how come with GDPR, the Global Data Protection Regulation, I always forget what the R is, how come with GDPR in force, why can organizations can capture and they can use user behavior to an extent that people cannot understand or comprehend? So why hasn't GDPR already solved this? Who'd like to take this? Maybe Timo, would you like to take this?
Yeah, why not? So, well, first of all, the GDPR was our first attempt to finally regulate the use of personalized data. So the problem is that the GDPR, it is a regulation, as you rightly said. It's only the first pillar. So the second pillar is the privacy regulation, and this is still not finished. So we are still discussing it. And they are two pieces of the same puzzle, which is not finished yet. So this is there is still a hole in our legislation. And then in the GDPR, there are many new loopholes. For example, the phrase or the legitimate interest. It wasn't clearly defined in the law itself what legitimate interest is, and now it's abused by the tracking industry, for example, to collect user data. And the legitimate interest is the interest for the collector to use the data. So this is absolutely misusing GDPR from my perspective. And finally, the data protection officers in the member states are working on it. So we saw a draft by the Belgian data protection office to finally ban the use of the banners, so the cookie banners. So it takes time to really use a new piece of legislation. But on the other hand, there are some loopholes we need to close.
All the panelists want to answer this. I'm going to so we move on to more questions. I'm just going to have one of you take this. Asha, why don't we go to you? Why do you think GDPR hasn't worked so far to handle this?
So I'll be very quick. I'm sure all of my colleagues have a lot of thoughts on this particular question, but I think it speaks back to what I was talking about in terms of the practicalities around enforcement mechanisms. We're talking about active live violations of GDPR in the manner in which it's being discussed. And I think that when we think about the resourcing behind the separate legal entity, when you have the European Data Protection Supervisor and the different advisors, and thinking about how they're limited in the resourcing that they have, the additional support that they need, and the practical enforcement, we need to look at the lessons learned from GDPR as we're looking into the development of the Digital Services Act. And this is why kind of making sure those enforcement mechanisms are adequately resourced, are fully independent, have the ability to be able to enforce in a way that's meaningful and transparent and complete across and harmonized across the union is so important. But we could talk about GDPR and the DSA for many hours to come, but I want to make sure that my colleagues have an opportunity to address some other questions as well.
Exactly. Yeah, I think we'll move on to the next question just because GDPR is such a huge topic, as we know. So the next question, also from an anonymous attendee, says, do the participants have examples of alternative content moderation models and alternatives to the toxic algorithms? I think we heard a bit about that before, but maybe just raise your hands if you have some concrete names of some other models. Yes, Sarah?
I'm going to cheat a little bit here, and so I'll be quick, because I just wanted to add what I don't think we've covered so far, which is that content and any content recommendation model is as good as the data that goes into it and the data that goes out. And one of the really crucial things we have to do, whatever model we pick up, is get transparency on the data sets that are forming how the recommendation algorithms work. We did a report in Assam looking at the data sets there during the National Citizens Register Act, which showed that the moderation algorithms didn't contain the Assamese language for racist insults towards Muslims. They completely missed any of that language. So after working with Facebook, they added 40,000 words to their algorithms, but that's a drop in the ocean. I'm sure that's repeated. So whichever system is used, it's got to introduce transparency over the data training sets. And I'm going to hand to a colleague really quickly.
Yes, Katarzyna, actually, you inserted a helpful link into the Q&A. So let's go to you next. You have a specific example.
Yes, indeed. This is an excellent group of people that is already experimenting with offering exactly what I have described before, alternative recommender system, alternative settings that people can choose using interoperability. Obviously, this is a long stretch because we still don't have full protocol interoperability and we don't have access to data, which Sarah mentioned. This is a very important barrier. So maybe one more sentence on this. We do need to mandate some form of access to data for such alternatives to flourish. So there is no surprise. We still don't have a huge market for this. That market cannot exist without the necessary regulatory framework we are discussing right now with our excellent MEPs here. And access to data does not necessarily mean access to personal data of all users on the platform. We don't have to be scared about that scenario. It would be a scary scenario, I admit, but what we are discussing in our expert circles is rather access to machine learning models developed by big platforms that could be shared with fair competition, especially if we are discussing competition which is non-market driven, non-commercial. So not everybody is in the game, but only public institutions or non-profits motivated by other values than just generating more profit.
Great. So and the name of the one that you sent the link for is You Choose, which you can Google. I pulled it up on my website here. It looks interesting. I'll take a look at it later. Here's a good question for Kim, I think. So this question is from Janet Kaiser. Are the current rules inadequate because the politicians don't understand the maths and the implications, so are unable to legislate? Is this stuff just too complicated for legislators? I think we hear this argument a lot when it comes to tech and Facebook in particular.
Look, I'm not gonna lie. I don't know how to program a Facebook algorithm. You know, that's not what I'm able to do. I don't know how to code, but I do understand that the way they have coded and that the way that they have built their algorithm is based on profit, and it doesn't, look at anything else than how to make more profit. It doesn't take into regard fundamental rights. It doesn't take into regard privacy, and it doesn't take into regard what is actually best for the people who use their platforms. And that is what I, as a policymaker, have to look at. Yes, there are also people. I mean, we have seen, of course, the hearing with Zuckerberg also in the United States that was highly embarrassing, of people who didn't understand, exactly how Facebook worked. But we have a lot of people who do know how Facebook works. And I think by now we are beyond the point where we have to exactly know how to code an algorithm to know that things are going horribly wrong, and that we really have to change things. And I think what my role is as a policymaker is to see the implications and come up with the rules that they need to abide by. I also don't know exactly how a house is built, but I know that what kind of houses we need. And I think that is also the way we have to approach legislation on big tech.
I think that's a very good analogy indeed. Sometimes I think that the expectations that we have of lawmakers in this particular area, people like to post the videos from the US hearing and stuff, but in the end, as you say, this is about high level policy, not the nitty gritty of coding. Okay, let's go to a panel that's come in via YouTube. This question comes from Tom Foal. Does the panel think that a zero trust approach where every user is independently authenticated as a real person with their country information available would help prevent the exploitation of these algorithms by malicious actors? So in other words, we could get rid of all those farms in Macedonia and elsewhere, North Macedonia and elsewhere. Who would like to take that? You can raise your hand. A zero trust approach. Yes, Sarah?
I can, but I suspect that Asha can also really speak to this as well. The problem with a zero trust approach is that the internet has always been and should continue to be a place where vulnerable groups can speak without fear of reprisal. So the answer to this isn't to target individuals or classify who can or can't speak, but to look to the design of the algorithms themselves. And I'm going to hand over to Asha because I knew she would have something to say on this.
Yes, Asha?
Yeah, very quickly. I kind of wanted to see if anybody else wanted to go ahead of me, but of course, I'm happy to speak to this. And again, it goes back to that civic space discussion. I'm talking about very concrete, say, human rights defenders, but this is for everybody who wants to engage in, say, any kind of decision or discussion online. It's vitally important that civic space actors, but anyone who feels like they may be experiencing a kind of silencing of their expression or their silencing of freedom of association, have the opportunity to do this with full protection and full privacy. Because if we take concrete examples of, say, women's rights activists who want to talk about SRHR in a country where this may be being limited, or LGBT activists or young people trying to experience or find information that's vital to them, and they're not able to do this in a safe and completely privacy respecting way, this is also creating another issue. So this is why that kind of holistic, comprehensive, research-informed approach is so important, because it can be quite easy to say, let's move ahead with this idea because it may solve the situation, but you may not necessarily be able to see the inadvertent consequences or the unintended consequences of what may be being put forward with ideas like this. So yeah, just very much agree with my colleagues there.
Claudia?
Yes, furthermore, it should also be kept in mind that such an approach would not be enough, and there is really the need for a holistic thinking and really of an overhaul of how these recommender algorithms work, because right now, as mentioned before, platforms are just doing anything to increase engagement because that's what gives them the most profits. They're not investing resources into content moderation in all languages or all regions in the world because they always place growth over safety, and there needs to be really a fundamental kind of change. There needs to be an overhaul of the surveillance-based business model and of these engagement-based algorithms in general, because right now there is no incentives, no real incentives for the platforms to change it, and that's why there needs to be really strong regulation in place to really rein in how these algorithms work and to make them may have the ranking based on other factors and not just the one that incites to click on it, or that increases angry reactions. So this is really the key of the problem.
Okay, let's take one last quick question. This one comes from YouTube. In view of the problems outlined here, shouldn't we also focus on educating this subject in schools in order to educate the society and make them aware of the dangers? I think probably everyone would say yes, but I guess the question is, how exactly should we do that? Does anyone have an idea of how we could do that? Claudia, I don't know if your hand's still up from the last one. No, okay. Yes, Katarzyna.
Well, on a skeptical note, I would say, yes, we can tell people that they are manipulated. The same way we tell to kids, don't drink alcohol or don't take drugs because it's so harmful, and they still do if the drugs and alcohol are available. So honestly, we have to fix the system or rebuild the system so that the potential for manipulation, addiction, and other harmful patterns is simply less. Less present for the kids, especially, rather than educating kids about the nature of these drugs and hoping for the best. And the other thing is, let's teach them how to rebuild such systems, how to code, how to be creative with technology. Teach them this rather than some kind of passive form of media literacy, so that they just understand these systems and get more depressed.
Yeah, exactly. I think this idea of media literacy has been around for a long time, but it's the question of actually what specific tools do you give people? Because it's one thing just to tell students, hey, be careful what you read online. And it's another thing to actually give them practical tools to digest it. That's all the time we have for the first panel. Thank you so much to our panelists for giving us a lot of insights there into algorithms. Let's move on to the next panel now, which is how to fix manipulative business models and what are the alternatives. So if the first panelist can shut off their video and the next panelist can turn on their video. Thank you all once again. So now we should have all of our second panelists appearing on the screen now. So the key questions that we want to solve in this panel is, what is wrong with the current business models of online platforms? And what are those business models having an effect? How are those business models having an effect on people? We can talk a little bit about how the DSA could fix the manipulative business practice models. And in particular, I think as we hear from Hogan later today, how some of those business models can be addressed, the specific things that she's revealed that Facebook was doing. And if we did address these problems, what would the internet look like? Is there a risk that we would stifle innovation by mandating what type of business models different companies could have? All of those things are what we're going to talk about in this next session. Let me introduce our speakers. So we have Marlene Sticker from WAG. We have Anna Mazgo from Wikimedia. We have Katie McInnes from DuckDuckGo. We have Nienke Palstra from Global Witness. And we have again two MEPs, Alexandra Geese from the Greens Group and Martin Shirdevan from the Left. Thank you all so much for joining us for this second panel. Alexandra, let's start with you. So let's talk about what Haugen has actually revealed. I mean, she revealed some of these inner workings where these business practices, I think, demonstrated quite of an apathy, let's say, toward the actual societal effects and the effects on people's mental health, and seemed to prioritize the profit incentive. And we've heard about that. And we've also heard that Facebook was kind of aware, she says, of these problems, but didn't remedy them because it would have meant less profit. Now, you've long been a critic of big tech's business models. Are Haugen's revelations pointing toward a broader problem online that's not just about Facebook, but is about like the whole tech world? And what's wrong with big tech's business models today, according to you?
Yeah, thank you. And hello to everybody, and thanks for having me. Well, I wouldn't say with the whole tech world, but with the business model called surveillance capitalism that has been quite successful in the last decade or the last 15 years. And that is based basically on exploiting us and as providers of personal data. So I think one aspect of the problem are the amplification mechanisms that Frances Hogan is speaking about with so much insight and also so much wisdom. But the question we need to ask ourselves, and you just did that, is why do they use these kind of amplification systems when they're so aware of the harm they are creating for society? And I mean, even Facebook thrives in a democratic society where people have exchanges in democratic ways. So they're basically destroying the basis on which also a company like Facebook lives. So looking deeper, the business model is exploiting our private, very personal data, collecting online data, offline data, tracking us everywhere, putting the data set together, and then inferring further conclusions and further data to add up to these huge profiles on every one of us. And then you have two different models. You have Facebook that allows advert and then sell that the predictions on which ad we are probably going to click on based on that information to advertisers. And then you have two models. You have Facebook basically allowing advertisers to target specific groups directly. And then you have Google, who does this huge broadcast offering and showing this data to hundreds and thousands of companies. So the first thing we have to do, and then in order to keep you on the platform, obviously, it's not only about advertising. In order to show you ads, they have to feed you content that will keep you specifically on the platform. Polarizing content, but that is something that tabloid newspapers used to do as well. I mean, like Bild Zeitung in Germany, and we all know how tabloid newspapers work. They use a lot of polarizing content. Why don't they have the same impact? Because in the internet, the kind of polarizing content is specifically tailored to our interests and especially to eliciting anger and fears or negative emotions in every one of us. And this is why people are being sent down rabbit holes. This is why negative emotions and therefore extremist, especially right-wing extremist political material works so well in the internet and is so superior to other kinds of progressive content, for example. This is why disinformation works so well, because it's just polarizing. And in order to stop that, we have to go back to the business model, and we have to make sure that, first of all, very large online platforms and possibly all platforms can't control all that personal data about us without us very, very specifically and knowingly conferring it to them, which is not what is the case right now. So we have to stop them from having that data. We have to stop them from using it for advertising. That's, I think, is the first thing. In terms of advertising, I think then the argument is, well, then you would have to pay for the internet, and that would be difficult, especially for poorer people. And I mean, that's not true. There's contextual advertisement, which has worked for decades, which has funded our media outlets, which has allowed our broadcasters to survive and so on. So there clearly is an alternative, and this is what we should go for.
Thanks a lot, Alexandra. Let's go to Marlene next. Now, Marlene, you've written a book called The Internet is Broken, but We Can Fix It. And you were also at the cradle of the internet years ago. So how has the internet been broken? What's been the process, according to you? And what is needed to fix it? And in that process, what will be the role of civil society?
Yeah, well, the internet is broken in several ways, but the thing that I think is most important now is that we're talking about some centralized actors that, and the potential of the internet was that it was distributed. It was an open protocol, and anybody could join and then be part of this becoming more and more larger network. But on the application level, we now have a few actors that sort of centralized all this. So they're the middlemen. And so this is one of the big design problems of the internet at the moment, that on the service level, the application level, we have a centralized internet, the Ubers, the Facebooks, the Googles. So one of the ways to fix it is to, again, redefine how we want to have these services. which means distributed social services. And this is possible. There is already a development in that direction with ActivePub, with Matrix. So there is the tendency to go that direction, but then we have to actively do this. So it is possible to go another direction, but then we have to actively also invest in it. Another problem for what we have to face is that by the start of I think large part of why we have so much richness in all the different diversity of the internet was from the beginning, it was a cultural endeavor. It was a commons. It was a place where people shared their ideas, shared also their new concepts. It was an open innovation. I don't think it's so innovative at the moment. I think innovation is stopped because of we have not enough actors to also challenge the current powers that be. So I think the whole idea of having a public domain, to see the internet as a public space and to care for the public space, it has been not taken care of in the early 90s because they thought, well, the market will do it. So this deep belief that the market will run innovation, I think, is one of the Holzpfade where we are on at the moment. And this is also my problem at the moment with how Europe is approaching it. It's still approaching the internet as a marketplace. And I think this is essential the problem. Personal data should not be traded. We need the integrity of the personhood as we have the integrity of our physical bodies. So our physical bodies, we're not supposed to sell parts of our body, not our kidneys, not our eyes, not our hands, no tissue. And so we should also trade personal data as part of the personhood and to secure the integrity of the personhood. So basically the first step we have to make is to see that the internet should be a public domain ruled by fundamental rights. And then only then after that you can say, well, this is something that the market is allowed to do. So, and now we start already in a discussion as it is a trade, it is a market, and then we try to sort of control the market. And of course, Europe also comes from this idea that Europe shares an internal market, but we have to spend our time now to define an open public European space.
Thanks a lot, Marlene. So let's go to Ninka next. Now, Ninka, Global Witness has been calling for a ban on surveillance advertising and has conducted investigations to help expose the problems with it. Tech companies say that the economy relies on these targeted advertisements and that they really couldn't function without them. So can the European economy really survive such stricter rules? And do you take the companies seriously when they make this argument?
Hi, and thanks very much for having me on the panel today. Firstly, I think we need to interrogate the degree to which the current system is actually good for the economy and the real winners and losers it produces. And secondly, look at what the alternatives are. What is the future if we leave this system? So clearly, surveillance-based advertising is what is giving tech companies and overwhelmingly Facebook and Google astronomical profits. But what about the SMEs that they are so keen to put forward as the beneficiaries of the system? The argument goes that thanks to these ads, SMEs can more cheaply and efficiently target prospective customers. But how good are these tracking-based ads anyway? We know ad fraud is a huge issue online, and it's served well by a highly complex and opaque ad tech system. By some estimates, about 25% of ad spend is lost to fraud. Facebook itself has been the focus of multiple lawsuits in the US over misleading metrics around ads, including overblown potential reach figures, something we've seen crop up in our own investigations. Bigger companies have ad fraud teams to help deal with this. SMEs are left with little recourse and little insight into the problem. There isn't time to go into everything now, but there are, of course, other losers too, not least publishers such as news organizations locked into a system that further erodes their income and autonomy, and most importantly, individuals whose rights are being breached on an epic scale. Our own polling with YouGov from earlier this year found that people in France and Germany are deeply uncomfortable with the way they're profiled and tracked for advertising, and only 1 in 10 is comfortable with their data being used in this way. Which brings me to the second point, that an alternative is possible. And it seems incredible that tech and advertising, as some of the most creative industries that pride themselves on ingenuity, are so reluctant to change. In particular, contextual advertising shows enormous promise. Google search is a good example where some of the best click-through rates exist, and it doesn't rely on invasive profiling and tracking. In fact, a recent poll commissioned by the online advertising trade industry body, IAB, found that 74% of respondents thought contextual ads was one of the most important strategies for the future when dealing with the upcoming loss of third-party cookies, and more so than any other strategy. We also have evidence of success from the Dutch public broadcaster NPO, and most recently a Norwegian news publishing group, which showed huge increases in ad revenue after making the switch to contextual. There's also evidence to show that when asked, consumers find contextual ads also more appealing. So can the European economy survive stricter rules? Yes, and a different model is possible. Maybe Facebook and Google make a bit less money, but what reality do we live in if we're going to prioritize the profits of tech companies and advertiser interests over people's fundamental rights? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So let's go to Katie next. So Katie, you're from DuckDuckGo. DuckDuckGo is a privacy-friendly search engine, and it's kind of presented as an alternative to Google and Bing's surveillance model. So it's often heard that there's an argument that ending surveillance-based advertising and recommendations will destroy small companies and kill innovation. So is it possible for free online platforms to make profit in a way that doesn't rely on these types of surveillance models?
Thanks, Dave. Absolutely. Here at DuckDuckGo, we collect no user information and yet show users contextual advertisements on our search engine results page based solely on their search query. This model, as others have mentioned, is privacy protective, as well as serving users with relevant and in-the-time offers that we think that they find useful. We have been profitable since 2014 using this model, and thanks to people's increased interest in privacy, we've been seeing record numbers of growth month over month on our search engine. Our vision is to bring privacy simplified in order to raise the standard of trust online. And we believe that many of the issues that people are rightfully concerned about on the internet stem from this lack of privacy. That lack of privacy leads to filter bubbles, discriminatory targeting, commercial exploitation, identity theft, misinformation, and chilling effects. We believe that we need to reform our data collection incentives and the use of behavioral ads to truly improve the system. Our business model shows that this can be done, and we hope that more companies join us. Privacy protective innovations come from companies like DuckDuckGo, but we need more market regulation in order to ensure that we and other companies like us can reach users. In the case of search engines, for instance, Google's strategy has been to lock down every possible access point to consumers with pre-installation deals. However, we're encouraged by the discussions in this context in the DMA and the Parliament, and hope that user choice obligations make it into the final text. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Katie. Let's go next to Anna from Wikimedia. So Wikimedia, Anna, uses a completely different model for content moderation. Tell us a little bit more about that model. And do you see alternatives to the business models we've been talking about already?
Thank you, Dave. Hello, everyone. Yes, it's a €1 billion question to answer in 2 minutes, but let's try. So indeed, our model is the community-led content moderation model. Let me explain it a little bit. So there is a service provider. In our case, it's the Wikimedia Foundation that provides the infrastructure, servers, etc., and basically also creates very concise and general terms of service, as every service provider should. And there is a community that does the actual content moderation, and the community is the contributors to projects such as Wikipedia and editors that that create for different language versions, for example, create sets of guidelines, basically on how to write an online Wikipedia. And by that, these guidelines are decentralized, and also they do not, and we believe they should not be connected to any sort of legal liability, as this is not about the legality of information, but rather how to make the project's quality better. So our content moderation model is based on community governance, on community ownership, on responsibility that the members of the community share for not only for the quality of the content, but also for the well-being of the community members, right? And it's based on transparency. You can also check always how the content has been modified, who edited, who changed, who deleted things. So basically, the premise that it's based on is if you see a problem, you can also fix it. Anyone can do that, which is, of course, very different from the social media model that is more, let's compare it to a fix my street model, right? You can, if you see a problem, you can then petition the platform to change or to make it better. But very often you cannot really do it by yourself. So, of course, our model is not applicable one-to-one to the proprietary platforms or to social media for many reasons. One of them being that if we combine the data extraction of users also with them providing a free labor to the platform, it's probably not the best solution to the content moderation on social media. This also brings me to the second question, which is basically, okay, so how can we do it differently? How can we have different models on the market? And of course, this data extraction model and surveillance-based model is so prevalent that I actually sometimes ask myself whether Wikipedia was established right now, whether it would be still possible under current circumstances. And I'm not so sure that actually the fact that it's the models that are based on data extraction are so prevalent that it would actually create enough space and enough incentives to actually build something that is based on community moderation. Well, what is needed then to create those different models? Besides, of course, trying to curb down the existing bad behavior that platforms have, I think that what is also important is a systemic support to other projects. So first of all, legislators have to remember that we exist, or that platforms that are not the big five exist, and that they have different moderation models, and they have different ways in which communities regulate their own behaviors. And we see that DSA is a bit lacking in that aspect, for example. I think, what is positive, I don't want to be completely negative about the future of a different internet or European internet, is that I think projects such as Wikipedia prove that an online space for living together, while not exactly loving everyone, because obviously that's not always the case in our projects, is possible. It's just that it is not very much compatible right now with what is sort of prevalent on the market. And this is where we have to make sure that there is space for that other models to grow. I hope we can discuss this more, and thank you for giving me the voice.
Thanks a lot, Anna. Finally, let's go to Martin. So Martin, we've talked about these toxic business models. In a hypothetical world where we didn't have these toxic business models, what would it look like? And how do you see these discussions progressing in the parliament to try to get us there, or as close to there as we can go?
Yeah, thank you, Dave, and hello, everyone. Let me maybe start with a more general remark in answering your question. I think actually that it is high time to stop allowing private companies to explore and literally usurp the internet and to claim it as their private space where you and me, we have to follow their rules. And from a perspective of regulation, we are actually talking about kind of an uncharted territory. We are entering uncharted territory here, but what we heard today from the representatives, from the NGOs, from the companies, from civil society, but also from the other lawmakers, is that it is very clear that the definition of what goes and goes not in the internet should not belong to the big tech, but to the people. And that's why I think we have to talk about the democratization of the internet as we know it today. We have to take it back under democratic control. And this is actually what is happening here in the European Parliament, or at least what some of the lawmakers try to take back democratic control over the internet by implementing a strong set of regulations with the Digital Services Act and also the Digital Markets Act. And if you ask the people what they expect, and you can also see this on Twitter, not only today, but during the last few weeks under the hashtag people versus big tech, is that there is an end to these toxic business models that we just discussed. And these business models exploit sensitive personal and behavioral data, but there is a clear wish for business models that are not depending on personal sensitive data, with high privacy standards. And also some of the speakers already highlighted that in their contributions. And secondly, I think in a more ideal internet, we should, and we have to discuss and also rewire the so-called attention-seeking business model. Unfortunately, and also other speakers already spoke about that, content displaying hate speech and violence have high engagement numbers. And here we have to talk about strong regulations for transparency. Here we have to talk about giving consent. Here we have to talk about also about different models of liability for the company. So let's stop this intransparent engagement-based ranking in our timelines. And finally, I think an ideal internet would consist of smaller companies, not the big tech. So we need to break up monopolies. We do not need more big tech companies that are too big to fail, that can dictate the rules. These were just few of the points that would consist, or that an ideal internet would consist of for me. But looking at the progress, to answer the second part of your question here of the discussions in the European Parliament, but I'm actually happy that finally we discuss in European politics about how to regulate big tech. But I think we are 10 years late. But even though we are 10 years late, we are heading at least a bit into the right direction now. But we really need to be careful here as European lawmakers that both the planned regulations, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, are not merely trying to, let's say, put a band-aid on kind of disease or whatsoever. For me, the objective of these regulations are pretty clear. We should focus on forbidding or stopping unfair practices and go against the underlying business models. And if we still think, and some of my colleagues unfortunately do, not those who took the floor here in today's event, but some of the colleagues do, that Facebook, Amazon, or Google will focus on anything besides their profits, then, well, we wouldn't be up to the task. So this is what we need to do. And this is at least somehow how an ideal internet could look like. And I think Shoshana Zuboff put it as, we need a democratic revolution against surveillance capitalism. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. So we're getting closer and closer to the start of this hearing. And I think that what we've heard today is that the current business models are troubling to a lot of people. The argument of the companies is that if you take away these profit incentives, then these types of companies just won't exist. There won't be innovation. But I think what we heard in this panel is it's how much innovation is actually happening at Facebook now, or some of these other companies. I think especially in recent years, it's increasingly less credible to make that argument. We also heard from Anna that, of course, other business practices already currently exist. There are other models in existence that people use. People use Wikipedia all the time. I'm a very active user, and that has a totally different business model, and it's still here. It's still working, and it's still very useful for a lot of people. So I think what we're hearing is some skepticism about the company's pushback about what would happen actually if we changed these business models. But of course, changing those business models is easier said than done, and it would be a big task. And this is what policymakers are trying to figure out. Is it something that regulators have to step in and do, or is this something that can be done more organically? So let's take some questions for the second panelists. Just a reminder, you guys can put your questions into the Q&A section down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will ask those to the panelists. So the first question here is coming from Yel Zwiedema. Many of the solutions proposed in this discussion seem to assume that the general public will start using more benign recommender systems if given the choice. But what if many social media users actually like, in the short term at least, to be recommended outrage? That's more about the algorithms, but tying this into another question more about the business is, people don't really, from an anonymous questioner, people don't really take to the streets to fight for their digital rights. How can we raise more attention and mobilize more people for this important topic? So taking those two questions together, how much do the users have to be brought in to this discussion and to this battle? Because this is something obviously campaigners care a lot about, politicians care a lot about, but your average user may not be paying very much attention and may not be as bothered as some of us think they should be. So what's the solution there in making people really part of this battle against the business practices? Anna, let's go to you first.
Thank you. Thanks also for combining those questions, because I don't think they are so separate. So as to the first issue, what people actually like and what if basically they prefer to be outraged and they prefer to function in this ecosystem, I mean, this is a speculation, maybe not, but I think people don't like it as much as they like hangover, in a sense. And let me follow on this metaphor. It is that when we are growing up in a drinking culture where basically a lot of social gatherings are, or all social gatherings are accompanied by alcohol, it's very hard for us to imagine that we could socialize in a different way, right? And I think we're kind of in this situation. We look at the social media landscape and we look at and we are basically used to it, and it's now hard to imagine that we can do it differently. And I think here, giving people more perspective on how much they can actually own the online space. So just tying also to what Marlene, you had so greatly explained, how they can own the space, could they actually be the custodian of their own online experience, opens their eyes to the fact that that things can be done differently, and the online interactions can actually be aimed at well-being and not at division and toxicity. And one more argument, if I may, is that then this outrage that people have can be directed actually toward the models, the companies that have the toxic models or the models themselves. And once people understand, I think, and this is the work for all of us, the advocates and the experts, the people understand that this is not some elusive conversation about rights that are very important, but still don't, connect that well in people's minds, maybe to their everyday life, but it really is about their everyday life, about the choices they make, about how they are with others, how they connect with their communities, what are their communities really, then I think we have a chance to bring more public attention to this. And I think part of that is the whistleblowing and the facts that we can basically use to demonstrate that there is this connection between the values and the everyday life.
Marlene, what do you think? How do we bring the general public into this fight?
I think they are already getting in. I think the People versus Big Tech movements now bring 70 million people together, which is more than ever. And I think so there is a momentum at the moment, a new dawn, hopefully. But maybe also what's important, during the last year, more and more SMEs started to come to us, to ask for help, because they feel that they don't know how to make their business because of big tech, because of the platforms like not just the Ubers and so on, but also the ones that are changing the idea how people will buy their products. So the shop holders are in trouble. The taxi drivers are in trouble. The workers are in trouble. So I think the story that we tell here is not just the citizen versus big tech, or my privacy is not just at stake. It's also our sovereignty, our strategic autonomy to organize ourselves. The cities have not the right on their own cities anymore. So I think maybe it's good to make it understandable that it's beyond the whole concept of privacy, which is of course at the core for many, and I'm really happy with the GDPR, but it goes really much further. It's about our strategic sovereignty and autonomy. Are we actually choosing our own life, or are we manipulated in the life that is being that is successful for the big tech parties? So maybe by broadening it, our story also to the SMEs, and not let us, because otherwise it's like left right. So the left people feel for the individual people and the civil rights, and then the right say, well, we are for the entrepreneurs. I really think it's also about the SMEs and the entrepreneurs, and for all the companies that want to do good, because there are many ways to make a thriving business on the internet without using surveillance capitalist models, as some of the people here already mentioned. And we have a lot of examples: Signal, Brave, Nextcloud, So there are many examples that can show us that we can do good and have nice and good services on the internet for people, but not excluding people and not taking away their business.
Yeah, that makes sense. Ninka, what do you think? I mean, is the general public on board in this concern?
Thanks. Well, we are working closely with the People versus Big Tech Coalition, and I do think there is a real challenge, to get kind of more traction amongst the general population. I think, unfortunately, and this is also Big Tech's playbook, is these issues are often made very technical, and it feels remote then from people in terms of how they can engage with these. When you talk about algorithmic scrutiny and the whole ad tech ecosystem, that's not something easy to understand. And I think that the onus is on us and the challenge is on us to tell better stories about what the problem is and how we address it. But also, I just wanted to say that in terms of these recommender systems and, giving people more control and ownership over their settings, I think absolutely that is an important way forward, but also ensuring that those protections and measures to protect people's rights are in place by default. So, we strongly believe that in the DSA for the article concerning recommender systems, the default should be that it isn't based on profiling, so that people aren't immediately forced and nudged into signing away their rights and receiving more outrage when that's not what they've wanted.
Yep, that makes sense. Okay, we have another question come in here from an anonymous questioner. Kim said that the big tech lobby is the largest in the EU. How can we counter big tech's lobbying activity and give the SMEs that say they cannot function because of big tech a voice? Maybe this is a good question for Katie to start with. I mean, how do you feel kind of overwhelmed by these big search engine giants when you're trying to talk to policymakers? Do you feel like your voice is being drowned out by these giants?
That's a great question. So I focus on the US, my colleague focuses on the EU. What we find is that in our discussions with policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic, they're very excited to hear from a company that not only has a business practice they can be proud of and they can talk about to others, but also one that is innovative and creating revenue while also being compliant with the GDPR and any new privacy laws that are passed here in the United States, which, we're still hopeful for a federal privacy law here. That said, we think that, there has to be regulations that are put into place to make it easier for smaller competitors like us to reach customers in the market. So we're very excited about the DSA and the DMA and how they could reform the system for the better.
Does anyone else want to speak to that? Ninka?
Hi, yes. I wanted to point to some work that we've been doing at Global Witness to shine a light on, as we see, the outsized access that big tech has with policymakers in Brussels. And I think also to highlight the work of Corporate Europe Observatory and Lobby Control in doing some excellent analysis to show just how huge this army of lobbyists is. And so I'll put in the chat now, but we've developed a Twitter bot which tweets out every time a big tech lobbyist meets with a senior commission official. And this is just to illustrate how often these meetings are happening, how much more that's happening than it is with, say, civil society, and how concerning that is when so much regulation is being decided. So I think undoubtedly, as we, the DSA and other pieces are being agreed, we need to keep in mind the huge power imbalances that are in existence during these negotiations.
Yeah, I think anyone involved in this ecosystem in Brussels knows how big the presence of big tech lobbying is here in Brussels. I imagine it's similar in Washington. So I think definitely what we've heard today is that there's concerns about the business models, but maybe the people, the general public, aren't as aware of the kind of predatory practices in the business models as they should be. And then we've also heard that there are solutions, there are alternatives. So we'll have to wrap it up there because the hearing is starting very soon. I want to turn it over back to Kim for some closing remarks before she rushes off to that committee room. Kim, glad you can still stay with us. What are your final thoughts after everything we've heard today?
Well, first of all, I think I'm just amazed by all these amazing speakers that were here together in one panel. Unfortunately, not in the same room, that is still not possible, but, like to have all these speakers here together and to hear, all these multifaceted views on how we can actually have a different internet, I think was very inspiring, and I'm gonna go quite hyped now to the hearing with Frances Haugen, where indeed I have to run to quite soon. So once again, thank you so much to all our wonderful speakers, the People versus Big Tech Coalition, WAAG, SDEPS, and my great colleagues, MEPs Alexandra Geese, Timo Wolken, and Martin Scheerdeman for your input today. And also a big thanks to everybody watching today and giving us these great questions to reflect on. And I think there are a number of very clear takeaways from today. First of all, we just know that for years, platforms have been profiting from the large scale spread of disinformation and hate, and their decisions are driven by profit, image, and shareholder value. Any impact on society or democracy is just collateral damage, as the courageous whistleblower Frances Haugen revealed in the past weeks. And they know the impact of their algorithm, but refuse to do anything about it. And these same big corporations are acting as guardians of our online space and public debate and miserably failing. And this is why we shouldn't look at them to fix the problem for us. And incentivizing platforms to delete even more only reinforces their power over our free speech. We have to tackle the root causes, which are a small number of very large and powerful platforms controlling our public debate, amplifying fake news and hate on a large scale, specifically targeting certain people for profit. And we must not forget about this big tech lobby. We mentioned it before. It's the largest here in EU policy. So for years, we've heard that any strong action will hamper innovation, that tackling root causes is simply impossible, that there are no alternatives. And today we have heard great examples of alternatives and that this narrative is not real. We've heard that alternative business models without constant tracking and manipulation exist and can survive without it. And we've heard about civil or community sort of projects more focused on public space as alternative means of information sharing. And we are at a crucial moment in time, a moment where people are sick of being manipulated online and see the direct impacts on our personal lives, free media, politics, and our democracies. We're at a moment where people will no longer take no for an answer. And today we stand here united. We stand united with my colleagues, Alexandra, Timo, and Martin from the Greens, the S&D, and the left. And we stand together with the People versus Big Tech Coalition, a coalition of 100 plus NGOs representing millions and millions of people worldwide. And we stand joined by businesses that prove toxic algorithms and business models based on constant tracking are not the only way forward. What we get to see online should not be up to CEOs and shareholders. We need to break big tech's power over internet users. So let's ban manipulation by toxic algorithms, micro-targeting, and dark patterns, and give people more information and, above all, meaningful control over recommender algorithms. How we regulate today's tech companies can only protect and strengthen our future society if we make bold choices. And we need to take the power over what we see online out of the hands of these private companies and place it back in the hands of the people. So we'll be now moving to the hearing. I will literally be moving to the hearing. And we will have a short break. You can stay online if you want to watch the hearing and keep the discussion alive. Not only here today, but keep on talking about the big challenges we're facing and that we are going to tackle in the coming months and years. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Kim. And yeah, I saw some people in the chat asking where they can watch the stream. Good news, you're already there. Just keep the YouTube window open and it's going to start in 15 minutes. Thanks to all the panelists for some really great insights. Thank you, Kim. We'll let you run off to the hearing and we're all waiting with bated breath for it to start. So chill out here, get yourself a coffee and get ready for some committee action. Thanks a lot for joining us this afternoon.